hello once again. I'm Pastor Jeremy Combs. We're looking at the doctrine of the divine in the book of Deuteronomy. Well, we're in Deuteronomy chapter 15, and if you'll recall, I think it's the first 6 to 7 chapters of the book deal with the Ten Commandments, the history of Israel leading up to them, and then the rest of the book really is much a exposition, expositing on how specifically they are to keep the commands. Well, we've been really looking at in the last several chapters, commandment number 3 about not taking the name of God in vain, maybe even a little bit of chapter 2, commandment number 2, where you are to make unto thee no graven images. Well, now we're getting into the 4th commandment, and this would be that we're remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And so with that in mind, we need to remind ourselves that there were Sabbaths, many Sabbaths in the Bible. We often think of the Sabbath as Saturday, as that one day a week. You work 6 days and then you take that day off. And truly, I mean, that is the main Sabbath. But there were a couple of other Sabbaths we're going to see today. There was a Sabbath every 7th year Sabbath. That is, you would work 6 years, and then on the 7th year, you would let the land rest. And this would also include the idea of returning any indebtedness. Now, those who are farming today understand the idea that giving that land rest is a very important thing for the land. Now, that doesn't make it any easier for the person that in that year has to let the land rest, but they let God do the work. I was driving down the road even this week and was looking at some of the fields. Boy, they're getting really sprouting up, and it's interesting. You look over at I think it's a wheat or a bean field, and you can see stalks of corn, and quite a few that are sprouting up there in the midst of them. You say, well, what is that? Well, that's probably what they planted last year. And some of those seeds, it's amazing how that works. They'll continue to sprout back into life and to regrow. Or maybe it is when they gathered that things fell down. And so really God had a way of still providing for them in that 7th year, but it would take a great deal of faith. And then there was the year of Jubilee, and this would be the 50th year. And like the 7 year, the 50 year was similar. And I thought about this. If you're going 7 years, you'd have a 49th and then a 50. So at one point, you would have 2 years almost in a row where you would not be tilling the land and debts would cease. And so this is the idea of the Sabbath. It was an idea of dedicating and giving to God. And so this chapter is largely going to entail what about debts and what about those who are indebted, or as the word is, it is called slave. So let's look at it, verse number 1 of chapter 15. At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release. Now, as far as we don't know that this ever happened. It's possible that it did, but it's interesting that nowhere in the scriptures is a 7 year or a year of Jubilee reported. And in fact, they go into captivity, part of the penalty because of those 70 years was for those years of Jubilee that they never, ever observed. And so God always gets what he deserves one way or another. It can be with our help or without it, but wouldn't we rather it be with? And so at the end of 7 years, you're to make a release. What are we to release? And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. Okay, so you would loan to your neighbor. Now, this is really hard for us to understand because we are such a monetized society. That is, that we deal in money, cash. Very rarely are we loaning somebody a house or land or food or whatever it might be. But here, that would have been what they would have been working with. And he says, if you have loaned them aught in that 7th year, you release it. That is, if you've got a loan on their land, or if they've sold their land to you so that you could use it for your farming purposes. When that 7th year came, you're to give it back. He shall not extract it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release, because that is God's land, because what he has is God's. Boy, wouldn't that make a difference in our life, how we lived, and really even how we gave, if we looked at the faith it takes for us to say, that's not my car, that's God's car. That's not my house. That's God's house. That's not my money sitting in that bank account. That is God's money that he's blessed me with. Of a foreigner, thou mayest exact it again. So this was largely for the nation of Israel. And so we're reminded that our brothers, those closest to us, our neighbors, are the ones. But foreign would be the idea of these would be loans that there was no sentimental attachment to it. I suppose if we were to attach anything practical to us today, it'd be kind of like you going to the bank to get a loan. So the idea would be you'd continue to pay that. That's a testimony to that person that does not know God. And by the way, this is a great reminder as well not to get into indebtedness. And if we have to, not to do it for any long-term amount of times. In the day and age we live in, obviously, to get a home, sometimes even when you're getting started to get a vehicle, the necessities of life, you sometimes do have to take that loan out. But we ought to be very careful with that and beyond what our needs are. Boy, it's debated. No, yes. God gives you the freedom to make your own decisions. But I think if you are going to do it, you better really make sure that they are some short-term deals here. Save when thou shalt be no poor among you. So this is going to have to happen, and you don't have to release the foreign. I was trying to remember if I read the last. Boy, I must be getting old. I was trying to remember if I read the end of verse 3, but that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release. So the foreigner don't have to. The brother or fellow um, Jew, yes, you had to do that. And you didn't have to observe this. This seventh year would not be necessary. The year of Jubilee would not be necessary if there were no poor among you. Well, uh, it's the obvious answer to that is there will always be the poor among you, as Jesus said in the New Testament, and as it will be reiterated in Deuteronomy. God really set up this system, and it is a great system. Sometimes we think about the system of our government, and it can be helpful in many ways to help people with food and other things to get back on their feet. But then it's also one that has great corruption in it from not only the political side, the politician, those who are authorizing it, but also from those who are receiving it, who can work and won't work because they're manipulating the systems. And what a mess. And we just find that the world systems for helping the poor can't help. They did a study several years ago about institutions that you give to help and goodwill others, and the administrative fees on the top, who they were paying, was just astronomical. And I understand that some people have to get paid to help administer those and organize and the day-to-day operations. But the report stated, I mean, they were getting paid, I mean, big time bucks. And yet the whole thought and the whole campaign behind many of these charitable organizations was that we were going to help the poor. Well, yes, they helped the poor to a percentage, but they were also helping themselves to a great percentage as well. And so, boy, there's nothing better than the way that God does things. For the Lord, verse 4, shall greatly bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. Let God bless you. If you will just do what's right, God's going to bless your life. Only if thou carefully hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. You got to carefully hearken to observe to do all these commandments which I command thee this day. For the Lord thy God blesseth thee as he promised thee, and thou shalt lend unto many nations, but thou shalt not borrow. And thou shalt reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee. God says, I'm going to bless you so much that there's going to come opportunity and you need to loan to other nations. They're going to come to you and you need to rule and reign over them. But I never intended for you to be the indebtor. I never intended for you to be the one that is being reigned over. Obviously, this will flip when they refuse to hearken carefully unto the law of God, and then they will be indebted, and then they will be reigned over. But God never intended it to be that way, just like he never really intended for there to be the poor. If they would follow God's system every 6 years, even the person that was so hard up because of pestilence or famine or what have you and had to sell his land now gets his land back and now has an opportunity after working for this person for so long. He's going to now go back and he's going to be given the things he needs to start that land, as we'll see coming up here in this chapter, and he's going to be able to get going again. This is the way God intended, but man's wicked, evil heart refuse to listen to God, and thus we find the poor you will have always with you. If there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of the gates in thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thy heart. So it takes faith to deal in these matters. It takes love. Nor shut thy hand from thy poor brother. So you need to have tough hands and a soft heart. Tough hands in, you ought to work. And as John Wesley said, gain all that you can when it comes to money, save all that you can, and give all that you can. So in other words, you ought to work hard, and as the Lord is blessing you and you're gaining all that you can, it's for the sole purpose of saving to help meet the needs that you have, but then also to give and to help meet the needs of another. But thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need, and that which he wanteth. We ought to open our hands wide. Most churches have what is called a benevolent fund. We here at our church have what we call the deacon fund, and it's a way of giving to the poor. I think everybody ought to do that. Now, I'm not against that. Maybe there's some other organizations, Salvation Army, others that you may want to give. I think you need to be careful. I think you ought to find out what they're giving to, what their overhead, other things are. The benefit of giving through your local church is there's no overhead in the fact of the pastor is getting paid, but yes, he's getting paid to administer the church and to preach, but there's not the extras on there. And then 100% of what you're giving, and that can tell you that for a fact here at our church, is going to go to help the poor and the needy. And we ought to be willing to open up our hands when we see a need, and that's the deal right there. And this is where our nation has gotten off base. It's not satisfying your wants, it's your needs. And I think things like SNAP benefits, other things, they've tried to kind of ratchet those down and tried to take off, sodas and other things like that. And I think that's a good and a noble thing, because really those benefits, if they're truly being used to help the poor, they ought to be used to meet their food needs. You say, yeah, but everybody wants a soda. Well, I understand that, but if you don't have it, you don't have it. If you don't have that for $4, $5, $6, $7 to buy yourself that nice cup of coffee, well, you pass by the coffee shop and you go home and you brew your own pot, okay? And again, I'm not saying you've got a little extra and you want to stop by and get you a nice cup of coffee, or you want to get you a soda. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, if you don't have, you don't have. And you need to make sure that you're having the right testimony and investing yourself wisely there. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release, is at hand, and thine eye be evil against thy poor brother, and thou givest him aught not, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be a sin unto thee. So this 7-year thing, I know what maybe some of you may be thinking here. You're thinking, well, people could take that to their advantage. Here's some guy, and he's down and out, and it's year number 5, or year number 6 maybe even, and he thinks, I'm going to go and I'm going to give him my land, and I'm going to get all my debts erased, and then I'm going to be okay, because this guy, instead of doing it 6 years, I only have to do it 1. And then maybe on the other end, the guy who's going to lend is thinking, boy, this guy has a need, and maybe it's a legitimate need, but man, we're in year 5.5, we're in year 6, 6.5. I'm going to have to release that debt pretty soon. God says, don't do that in your evil heart. We ought to be not a respecters of persons. We ought to give because that there is a need. And we need to be careful. I think about it as a church. We're careful. I try not to give to needs based upon who has come to church. Obviously, I don't know who gives, but that would be another factor. That do they give, do they not? Doesn't matter to us, okay? We need to give. And, sometimes you say, yeah, but what about giving to people that are just manipulating the system? Well, I think you need to pray and ask God for discernment, but I think we need to be careful that we're not so cynical that we don't give because we don't want to be abused. Now, obviously, sometimes I make it a habit not to give cash. There's someone poor and they need something to eat. I'll go through the drive-through, get them a burger or something. There's somebody, we do this here at church, and they want money for when our power's going to get turned off. We will say, okay, and we will go to the electric company and we will pay through the electric company, so that therefore that is going to the need that they have. And I'll tell you, you'll find a lot of people that eliminates these quote unquote needs that they have. I think especially I was out back at church, and someone pulled up and said, hey, my kid has no formula and we're trying to find something for him, and can you help us? And I said, yeah. I said, hey, right across the bridge here, about 2 or 3 miles away, there's a Walmart. I'll run in there and I'll buy you formula. And he said, no, 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 I can't do that. I'm headed to Terre Haute. That's out of my way. I said, it's not that far out of your way, and you can go up 63. And he said, no. And I said, hey, listen, bud, if I had a kid that had a need and needed to eat, I'd go 2 hours out of my way to make sure that they got the food that they need. And he kind of grumbled, got in the car, and left. Well, what he wanted was cash. And see, when I refused to give cash, but said I will meet the need because it did feel for the baby, boy, the need all of a sudden disappeared and was no longer there. And that's such a sad, sad thing. But God gives to the just and to the unjust. The sun, the rain goes down. And so we ought to be willing to give and let God sort that out. Now, don't be foolish in your giving. But make sure that don't be so cynical that we never ever give. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved. Verse 10. We shouldn't be upset. We shouldn't be angry about that when thou givest unto him, because that for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thy works and in all that thou puttest thine hand to do. Don't be grieved. Don't be grudging in your giving. God always returns to us. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. There you go. Therefore I command thee, saying, thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, to the needy, and to the land. Well, I didn't quite make it through the chapter, but there's a lot of stuff in there about the poor. Think about the poor that are around you today. How can you be a help to them? And think about it in ourselves. God never intended for us to be indebted. God wants us to be wise with our funds, but obviously there is a little bit of an opening there that when hard times fall, sometimes we have to humble ourselves and we need to get the help we have, but we ought to be willing to repay it, and we ought to be getting back on our feet. Hey, thank you for joining us. We'll finish up chapter 15 next time.